the law of Lent is not made for the spiritual man, because the spiritual man, the one who wants to reach a degree of perfection, what they do is they actually go beyond the law. Blessed Dennis the Carthusian has a lot of good stuff about this, but they want to go beyond the law. They want to exceed the law, and they want to reclaim a lot of the more rigorous aspects of the fast. So the reason I give you the history is because this will give you a lot of good examples of actually how to practice this. But yeah, that is just sort of fundamentally, that's the difference between fasting and abstinence. Hassan, is there anything that you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, sure. I guess I have three main thoughts. The first one is about the time of taking the main meal. So nowadays, and as of a couple of hundred years ago, we started to make the distinction between a normal fast and a Eucharistic fast. And this is partially because the normal fast was nowhere near as strenuous as the Eucharistic fast, especially.
You muted yourself.
Yeah, sorry. So basically, the Eucharistic fast, now it allows liquids, but it previously didn't allow you to take in anything at all, what was sometimes called a natural fast in some of the authors. You don't take any material into your body at all. And actually, there was no distinction between the regular fast and the Eucharistic fast initially. Even if you weren't receiving the Eucharist, even if you weren't going to go to Mass, the time that you would take your meal would be after the proper Mass of the day, sometimes called a conventual Mass, the proper time for that Mass. And so on a normal weekday, that Mass would be ahead at 12 after Sext. On a penitential day, it would be after none. On a Sunday or anything semi-double and up in the old feast system, it would be at 9 after terce. And so every single day there was a certain time after which you would be eating unless you were dispensed because of the kind of work that you have to do. And this was for everyone. This wasn't there's this idea that fasting is for monks if you're a Christian, which is just completely out there. In fact, I find a lot of modern Catholics think that the fasting stuff's just a little bit overboard. If you're not a monk, you should just enjoy yourself. But this knocks out like a good third of the Christian year's spiritual significance. So that's the first thing, is about the time of the time of the meal. You mentioned briefly that it evolved from after evening prayers to after afternoon prayers to afternoon prayers. And this generally happened through, and this is a little bit funny, we discussed this once on a previous stream. On penitential days, people would gradually anticipate the evening prayer 3 hours earlier, gradually, and then another 3 hours earlier. So what you would have is you would have people basically liturgy maxing so that they can get everything done by Sext by about 12 p.m. and then break the fast. So they would just be doing liturgy for like 3.5 hours straight to get everything done. So that's the first thing about the time of taking the meal. And this is actually not like an arbitrary historical thing. I'll try and say why this matters now. The quality of prayer is different when you're in a fasted state. The reason why fasting and abstinence are not just like any other penance or mortification that you could do is that it has a special quality, which is that it puts you into a state where your prayers are more effective on account of the state of your body and the way that that's related to your mind. Some people have described it as a state where you're like seeking, right? And this is why our Lord says this kind, which refers to all mortal sin according to St. Thomas, cannot be cast out other than by prayer and fasting. And so many of the ancient saints refer to prayer and fasting as two wings. If you only have one wing, you can't fly, right? So basically, the time of prayer, the time of breaking the fast is closely related to the purpose for fasting in the first place, which is why a lot of people who break their fast at midday don't report much of a benefit from fasting, because the prayers that they do before the midday meal are not substantial, and they're not done while in a fasted state. Whereas if you're taking your meal somewhere between 4 and 7 after doing your evening prayers, and you don't have to pray the canonical vespers, you could pray the little office or a rosary or some other chaplet, you could do anything. But if you do some substantial devotion once you've reached that state before taking your meal, that's the most effective way to maximize the benefits of the fasting day. Because fasting is a practical action. It's not a unit of good boy points that you get for doing it. Although that does exist, there is merit in action, but the point for fasting is to dispose yourself to better prayer. So that's the first thing about the time of fasting. The second is a very brief thing about that's from taken from Pruma. It's quoted in this book that we sometimes use, The Definitive Guide to Catholic Fasting and Abstinence, where Father Pruma says, the hour, according to modern discipline, the hour when the one full meal will be taken is left to the choice of the individual, and therefore he is free to interchange the times of the evening collation and the full meal. However, this meal must have a moral continuity. This is important. So this is to do with the length of the meal. The meal should not be unduly protracted. If there is a notable interruption, for example, an interruption of half an hour, then this would be reckoned as 2 distinct meals. Authors are sufficiently agreed that on fasting days, the meal cannot lawfully be extended beyond 2 hours refection. So it's quite lenient, but the point is that in principle, a meal should not be taken over a very long period of time. You should try and keep it brief. And on top of that, you shouldn't stagger it. You shouldn't take part of the meal and then take a break and then eat more. And just speaking from experience, like in Muslim practice, there are a lot of Muslim families that do this. They finish their evening prayers, they take a snack. So they take a snack, they do their evening prayers, they take a meal, they wait 2 hours, they take another course, they wait another 2 hours, they eat some more, and then they struggle to fall asleep with a belly that's full, even though it's shrunk down from fasting the daylight hours every day. And people actually go to hospital because they eat too much food and their stomach ruptures. So you really don't want to abuse fasting times like that. And this leads into the point about, okay, so why abstinence? What's the benefit of practicing abstinence when you're fasting? Isn't it already enough to only eat one simple meal after your evening prayers and then one collation? Well, the reason why you practice abstinence is not supposed to be, which is unfortunately what many of you guys have got wives or you have mothers who are going to be cooking for you while you're trying to do your penitential days. And if they agree to follow the abstinence rules, you will find that unless you are very insistent, they will take it as a culinary challenge. They will say, okay, so I've got these ingredients removed. I can't use meat. I can't use eggs. I can't use dairy. Maybe you're not going to let them use fish. Maybe you're not going to let them use oil, especially in Holy Week. And then they're going to say, how can I make the most delicious meal possible with these culinary restrictions? And then they will do it. And if you sit there and you go, well, this technically doesn't break the rules, and then you eat the very yummy food with no objections, yes, technically you're not breaking a couple of legal rules, okay? But the legal rules are not for their own sake. They're for the sake of making you eat simply, and most important thing, it's so that you turn away from the goods of the senses so that your heart will be more open to those goods which are above the senses. So those are the 3 kind of takeaways from this. It's that you need to make sure that fasting is a process that turns your heart away from sensory goods. Second, you need to make sure that your fasting is something which is done in such a way as to successfully dispose your mind to pray more easily, which means you don't eat stupidly small amounts, and you don't eat in a stupid way so you become anemic or something. You need your physical health, otherwise you're going to damage your prayers because you're not going to focus properly. So you need to maintain your health. It's all for the sake of disposing the mind to better prayer, etc. The purpose of fasting is not to like literally damage your body as a kind of like sacrifice. That's not the
Yeah.
goal here. The goal is to dispose the mind to more effective prayer. So
Yeah.
those are just things I would add. Yeah.
Yeah, on this point, I'm glad that we took it in this direction, because there's a point that Saint Ignatius brings up in his spiritual exercises when he's talking about penance, because fasting really is it's a type of penance, right? And we all know the effects of penance, right? Penance is a meritorious act. Penance, it satisfies for sin. Penance is something which disposes us towards prayer. How does it dispose us towards prayer? Well, it's because it detaches us from earthly things, and attachment to earthly things is that which drags us away from prayer. Read St. John of the Cross, Ascent of Mount Carmel, book 1. He goes into this in a lot of detail, gives a lot of arguments, scriptural exegesis. It's very good. But really, St. Ignatius makes the point. He says that there's sort of two tendencies that a lot of people will have in fasting, and you have to be careful about deluding yourself, which is why it's important to have somebody in your life who's a spiritual director, who's able to temper you in this way. Because some people, what they will do is these people will go way too hard on themselves. This is pretty rare now. I mean, in the early church, throughout church history, we know a lot of people were doing penances that were crazy, like sleeping on glass. They were just walking on glass. They were just letting their flesh like rot, and there'd be maggots in them. There was a lot of crazy stuff which was going on amongst a lot of the very holy people. These were very holy saints who were damaging their health, damaging their body. St. Ignatius says, you can't do that. You can't damage your health because, as Hassan said, basically the means are proportioned to the end. So the end of fasting is prayer. The end of fasting is penance. The end of fasting is to remove sin, to detach us from earthly things. So because the end of fasting is this, we need to take the means in proportion, which means in my particular state in life, which means are actually best proportioned to that end. Extremely important to recognize that. So if you're damaging your health, you're actually not proportioning the means of fasting best to the end of prayer. But on the other hand, he says that it's very easy to delude ourselves and think that we're going too hard on ourselves when actually we're not going hard enough. So all of these things, remember, there's a natural precept of fasting. There's a general precept of fasting, which we might get into in a minute. I really want to get into this from St. Thomas. There's that general natural precept of fasting, but specifically in conscience, we are obliged to fast on the fasting days of the church. Everything above that is going to be, somehow voluntary. So what you have to do is you have to discern, in my state in life, what is best. And it's very easy to delude yourself by not going hard enough during fasting periods, to take too much food when you're eating, to eat too frequently, to add collations in when you don't need to add collations in. It's very easy to actually go beyond this. So it's very good and it's very prudent to actually have a spiritual director of some sort who is able to be an external guide to what you're doing during fasting. It's extremely, extremely important. So one of the points I think is really important that Hassan is very apt to help us is that when it comes down to the practicality of fasting, the reason people think they're going too hard is because they're fasting wrong. So what a lot of people will do is they'll kind of set themselves up for failure by saying, I'm going to, drink this water or whatever throughout the day. I'm just going to kind of, wait until the evening, eat during the evening, and kind of not put too much thought into it otherwise. And it's very easy to actually, when you're not doing this in the proper way, when you're not, making sure you have vitamins, making sure you're consuming salt, consume a lot of salt during fasting seasons. When you're not doing stuff like that, it's very easy to make yourself feel worse, like as to the physical effects, and not actually get the true benefits of fasting.